October 8, 1938, 6:15 p.m., a private dining room on the third floor of Roseland Ballroom, Midtown Manhattan. The windows were draped with heavy curtains, blocking out the fading autumn light and any possibility of surveillance from the street below. Lucky Luciano sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his hands folded in front of him, his pale blue eyes studying the two men who had just been brought into the room. One was Vincent Asaro, underboss of the Gambino family, a man who had survived 30 years in the underworld by being meticulous and careful. The other was Salvatore Maranzano Jr., who had inherited his father's territory and most of his father's enemies after the elder. Maranzano had been assassinated in 1931. Luciano didn't stand. He didn't gesture for them to sit. He simply watched them with the patient gaze of a man who had spent decades studying human nature, understanding weakness, and converting that understanding into power. Lucky Luciano was 39 years old, born in Sicily, brought to America as a child, and risen to control the largest organized crime syndicate the American underworld had ever seen. Unlike his predecessor Meyer Lansky, who was brilliant but preferred to work from the shadows, Luciano was willing to be seen. He was willing to let people know exactly who made decisions and who enforced them. His face was sharp, his features arranged in a pattern that suggested both intelligence and complete absence of mercy. He dressed expensively, but not ostentatiously. Nothing about his appearance said powerful criminal. Everything about his manner said this man is accustomed to being obeyed. Gentlemen, Luciano said, his voice soft but carrying perfect clarity across the room. We have a problem. And the problem is that the problem isn't being solved. Someone needs to explain to me why I'm sitting here having this conversation instead of reading a report that tells me the issue has already been addressed. Vincent Asaro shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the situation with Bumpy Johnson is complicated. He controls most of the numbers game in Harlem. He's built relationships with the police. He's gained the loyalty of the community. It's not as simple as just moving him out. Luciano leaned back in his chair, and his expression didn't change. But something in the room got colder. Complicated. That's the word you're using. Vincent, do you know what I do when situations become complicated? I simplify them. I reduce them to their most essential elements. In this case, the essential element is this. We decided 4 years ago that Bumpy Johnson would operate in Harlem under our protection, and in return, he would pay us a portion of his revenue. That was the agreement. We were clear about it. We even sent representatives to explain it to him. Salvatore Maranzano Jr. cleared his throat. He refused the arrangement. He said Harlem wasn't for sale. He said the agreement that had been made, the one that kept New York's neighborhoods separate, was still valid. He said he wouldn't pay tribute to anyone. Luciano nodded slowly. Yes, I'm aware of what he said. What I want to understand is why his refusal is still his refusal. Why hasn't it become our agreement? Why is he still operating independently in Harlem when he's made it clear that he doesn't respect our organization? Because, Vincent said carefully, moving against him creates complications beyond Harlem. The black community has proven willing to stand with him. They did it against Dutch Schultz 4 years ago. They'll do it again if we move against him. Luciano closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his gaze was fixed directly on Vincent Asaro. I'm going to explain something to you, Vincent, and I want you to listen very carefully because I'm only going to explain it once. The only reason the black community stood with Bumpy Johnson against Dutch Schultz was because they believed Bumpy was their protector. They believed he stood between them and the wolves that wanted to devour them, but what they don't understand is that we're not wolves. We're businessmen. We don't want to destroy Harlem. We want to profit from it. And if Bumpy Johnson would understand that, if he would understand that paying us money is far preferable to the alternative, then he would do it. Salvatore Maranzano Jr. spoke up. We could arrange a meeting. We could explain the situation more clearly. Exactly, Luciano said. And now there was something almost like satisfaction in his expression. We're going to arrange a meeting, but it's going to be the right kind of meeting. It's going to be a meeting where Bumpy Johnson understands that he doesn't have a choice, that the community can't protect him from what we're going to do if he continues to refuse us. And it's going to be a meeting that takes place on our terms, in our space, with our people surrounding him. After we're done with that meeting, Bumpy Johnson is going to understand that refusing Lucky Luciano is the most expensive mistake he could possibly make. 2 days later, on October 10th, Bumpy Johnson received a message. It didn't come through normal channels. It didn't come through anyone in Harlem. It came through a man named Joseph Bonanno, a captain in one of the 5 families, a man who had been tasked with delivering a simple message. You will meet with Lucky Luciano on October 12th at 7 p.m. The location will be determined and communicated to you on the morning of October 12th. You will come alone. You will not bring weapons. You will not tell anyone in Harlem about this meeting. If you fail to appear, Luciano will consider it an act of war. Bumpy was sitting in his office above a butcher shop on 125th Street when he received the message. He was reading through the daily numbers from his operation, checking the accounting, making sure that every penny was accounted for. Yorkshire Pete, now his most trusted lieutenant, was standing by the window, watching the street below. Yorkshire Pete turned from the window. They want you to come alone. That's a suicide move, Bumpy. You go to a meeting with Lucky Luciano surrounded by his men, and you might not come back. Bumpy set down the numbers he'd been reviewing and leaned back in his chair. If Luciano wanted me dead, Pete, he wouldn't need to arrange a meeting. He'd just kill me. No, this is something else. This is pressure. This is him making a move to force me into a position where I have to give him what he wants. But why? Pete asked. Why would he risk this? Why would he bring you into a room with his people when he knows what it might do to his reputation if something happened to you? Because, Bumpy said slowly, he believes that money is more powerful than community. He believes that fear is more powerful than loyalty. He believes that I'll choose to pay him tribute rather than face what happens if I refuse him. And he's probably right that a lot of men would make that choice. Pete looked at him. But you won't. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Harlem. The streets were busy, alive with people going about their lives. They trusted him. They believed that he stood between them and the forces that wanted to exploit them. They had proved it 4 years ago when they stood against Dutch Schultz, and now he was facing a choice that would define everything that came after. If I pay Luciano, Bumpy said quietly, it's not just about money. It's about giving him the right to take from Harlem. It's about saying that his power is greater than our community's autonomy. It's about breaking the principle that has kept Harlem independent. Then you'll refuse him, Pete said. I'll refuse him, Bumpy agreed. But refusing him is going to require more than just words. It's going to require me to show him something that he doesn't believe exists. It's going to require me to show him that a man from Harlem, a colored man that he probably considers inferior, can look him in the eye and say no. And that when he tries to enforce his will, a community is going to stand behind me in a way that makes that enforcement impossible. The morning of October 12th arrived cold and gray. Bumpy received a telephone call with his instructions. The meeting would take place at 287 Park Avenue South, in an office building that Luciano controlled. The time was 7 p.m. He would be met at the street entrance by a man named Tony Mouillon. Tony would escort him to the office. He should bring nothing with him. He should tell no one where he was going. Bumpy called a meeting of his inner circle. Yorkshire Pete, Ellsworth West, and Razor sat in his office, listening as he explained what was going to happen. When he finished, there was a long silence. You're going to walk into that building, Pete said, and you're going to be surrounded by Luciano's men. How is that not a death sentence? Because, Bumpy said, I'm going to control the narrative. When I walk out of that building, whether it's with Luciano's agreement or without it, I'm going to walk out. And when I do, everyone in Harlem is going to know that I sat with Lucky Luciano and didn't back down. They're going to know that I looked one of the most powerful men in America in the eye and said no. And they're going to make their choice based on that. They're going to decide whether they're with me or whether they're with Luciano. Ellsworth West leaned forward. That's a gamble. If Luciano decides to make an example of you, if he has you beaten or killed or whatever he decides to do, then all of that loyalty means nothing. Bumpy smiled slightly. Ellsworth luck has always been on my side. That's why I'm still alive when Dutch Schultz is dead. That's why I'm still operating when other men have been arrested or killed. And I have to trust that luck is going to be on my side today as well. But more than luck, I have to trust that Luciano, for all his power, doesn't fully understand what he's up against. He believes that power comes from money and guns. He doesn't understand that it comes from community, and that's his weakness. At 6:45 p.m., Bumpy left his apartment and headed downtown. He had instructed Yorkshire Pete to make sure that word spread through Harlem about where he was going. He had made sure that by the time he arrived at Park Avenue South, everyone in his community knew that he was meeting with Lucky Luciano. He had made sure that if anything happened to him, it would be known throughout the entire city. It was a small insurance policy, not much, but enough to matter. The office was on the 22nd floor. The elevator ride felt endless. When Bumpy emerged, he found himself in a corridor with 3 men standing nearby, their hands visible, their postures suggesting that they were armed and ready to use their weapons if necessary. Tony Mione was the oldest, maybe 50, with a scar tissue around his eyes from years of boxing before he'd gone into the more lucrative business of being an enforcer. "He's waiting for you," Tony said, gesturing toward a door at the end of the corridor. The other 2 men fell in step on either side of Bumpy, not quite touching him but close enough that he could smell the cigarettes and cologne they wore. The office was large, expensively decorated, with a view of Manhattan stretching out below. Lucky Luciano was sitting behind an enormous desk, dressed in a 3-piece suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. There were 4 other men in the room, all large, all clearly armed, all watching Bumpy with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. "Bumpy Johnson," Luciano said, smiling slightly. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate your cooperation. Please, sit down." Bumpy sat in the chair across from Luciano's desk. The 4 men remained standing, positioned behind him, blocking any possible exit. Bumpy understood immediately that this was intentional. Luciano wanted him to feel trapped. Luciano wanted him to understand the precariousness of his situation. "I've been following your career with some interest," Luciano continued. "You've done well for yourself in Harlem, built a solid operation, earned the loyalty of your community, managed to stay out of prison. That's respectable. That takes intelligence and discipline. But I think you've become confused about something. I think you've started to believe that Harlem is yours, that it belongs to you independent of any larger structure, that you can operate in New York without answering to anyone." Bumpy met his gaze steadily. "I operate with the understanding that Harlem belongs to the people of Harlem, and I answer to them." Luciano stood up and walked around the desk. He wasn't a large man, maybe 5'8", but he carried himself with the certainty of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't control. "You answer to them because they're useful to you, because they provide you with revenue and protection, but they're not your equals, are they? You make decisions. You tell them what to do. They obey because they believe you're strong. But strength is a matter of perspective. And from where I'm standing, I see a boy who doesn't understand the actual power structure in this city." Bumpy didn't respond immediately. Luciano walked to the window and looked out over the city that he believed he owned. The city stretched out below them, millions of lives being lived according to rules that Luciano had created and enforced. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men in America, and he was about to explain to Bumpy Johnson exactly what that meant. "Here's what's going to happen," Luciano said, turning back to face Bumpy. "You're going to return to Harlem, and you're going to inform your people that you've agreed to pay the families 20% of your revenue. You're going to reorganize your operation to ensure that 20% comes directly to me, to my account, every week. And, in return, you'll have our protection. No other organizations will be allowed to move against you. No law enforcement will be allowed to interfere with your operations beyond what they already do. You'll be protected as long as you comply with our agreement. And, if I refuse?" Bumpy asked. Luciano smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "Then I will make an example of you that will echo through every black neighborhood in America. I will have your organization destroyed. I will have your people arrested or killed or turned. I will make sure that every criminal in this country understands that refusing Lucky Luciano is the most expensive mistake they could possibly make. And I will do it in a way that makes your resistance look not like nobility, but like stupidity. Your community will abandon you because they'll understand that standing with you is standing in the path of a hurricane, and they'll step aside rather than be destroyed." Bumpy took a moment to consider what Luciano had said. He thought about the power that Luciano represented. He thought about the resources, the connections, the ability to move men and money and law enforcement in coordinated ways. He thought about the fact that he was sitting in a room surrounded by men who would kill him without hesitation if Luciano gave the order. And then he thought about Harlem. He thought about the faces of the people who trusted him. He thought about Yorkshire Pete and Ellsworth West and Razor. He thought about the numbers runners, and the street hustlers, and the shopkeepers, and the people who had stood against Dutch Schultz because they believed in him. "With respect, sir," Bumpy said, his voice calm and even, "I believe you're wrong about something. You believe that community is something that can be broken through force. You believe that if you threaten the people who stand with me, they'll turn against me. But that's not how it works. That's not what happened 4 years ago when Dutch Schultz tried to take over. The more he threatened, the more unified Harlem became. And the same thing will happen if you move against me. The more you try to break us, the stronger we'll become. Luciano's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. You're sitting in a room with men who can kill you, and you're talking to me like we're equals. We're not equals, Bumpy Johnson. I've built an empire, you've built a neighborhood operation. The difference is vast, and you're about to learn what it means to disrespect that difference. I'm not disrespecting anything, Bumpy said. I'm being honest. You ask me to pay tribute, and I'm telling you that I won't. Not because I don't fear you. I do, but because if I pay tribute, everything I've built in Harlem collapses. The community will understand that I've surrendered to outside pressure. And once that happens, once they understand that I can be broken, I become useless to you anyway. You can't rule through someone who no longer has the loyalty of his people. Luciano walked back to his desk and sat down. He folded his hands in front of him and studied Bumpy with new intensity. You're either very brave or very stupid, he said finally, and I haven't yet decided which, but I'm going to give you something. I'm going to give you an opportunity that most people don't get when they refuse Lucky Luciano. I'm going to give you 1 week. In 1 week, you're going to be back here, and you're going to tell me that you've reconsidered. You're going to tell me that you've decided to pay the tribute. Or, you're going to tell me that you've decided to resist. And if you decide to resist, then the war starts. And I promise you, Bumpy Johnson, this war will be like nothing you've ever experienced. Bumpy left the building at 8:15 p.m. He walked down Park Avenue in the cool October evening, trying to process what had just happened. He had looked Lucky Luciano in the eye and said no. He had refused one of the most powerful men in America, and he was still alive. That was something. By midnight, the story had spread through Harlem. Bumpy Johnson had been summoned by Lucky Luciano. Bumpy Johnson had refused to pay tribute. Bumpy Johnson was now at war with the 5 families. The news spread like fire through a dry forest. By morning, every person in Harlem knew what had happened, and the responses varied. Some people were terrified, some were inspired. All of them were paying attention. Bumpy called another meeting. This time, he didn't just include his inner circle. He included representatives from every significant operation in Harlem: numbers runners, policy bankers, protection racket operators, bootleggers. All of them, maybe 50 people in total, gathered in a church basement on 127th Street. Here's the situation, Bumpy explained. Lucky Luciano has demanded that I pay him 20% of my revenue. I've refused. As a result, we're now in a position where he might try to enforce that demand through violence. And I want to be clear about what that means. It means that all of us are at risk. It means that Luciano will try to destroy every operation in Harlem that stands with me. So I'm not going to ask you to stand with me. I'm going to let you make your own choice. You can cut your ties with me. You can try to work out your own arrangement with Luciano. You can abandon Harlem entirely, or you can stand with me, understanding that it might cost you. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Yorkshire Pete stood up. I'm with you, Bumpy. Whatever comes, I'm with you. Ellsworth West stood next. Me too. You've earned my loyalty. I'm not abandoning that because Lucky Luciano is rich. One by one, the others stood. Numbers, runners, policy bankers, protection operators, all of them understanding that what was happening was bigger than money. It was about whether Harlem belonged to its own people or whether it belonged to outside interests. By the end of the meeting, every significant operator in Harlem had committed to standing with Bumpy Johnson. Not because they weren't afraid of Luciano, they were, but because they understood that surrendering would cost them something that money couldn't replace. It would cost them their dignity. It would cost them their autonomy. Over the next week, Luciano made his first moves. He reached out to some of the smaller numbers runners in Harlem, offering them money and protection if they would abandon their loyalty to Bumpy and work directly for Luciano's organization. Some accepted, but some didn't. Those who did were immediately cut off by the rest of the community. They were no longer welcome in the restaurants and bars that served Harlem's underworld. They were shunned by the women they had relationships with. They became pariahs, earning money from Luciano but losing everything else that mattered. Luciano's enforcers moved into Harlem and tried to interrupt some of Bumpy's operations, but when they showed up, they found not just Bumpy's men waiting for them, but entire blocks of neighborhood residents. Not armed residents, mostly. Just people, men and women, and sometimes even children, all standing together, making clear that this was their neighborhood and outside forces weren't welcome. The enforcers, trained to deal with violence, trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force, found themselves confused and frustrated by an opposition that couldn't be met with guns. By October 18th, Luciano was facing something he hadn't encountered before. He was facing a form of resistance that couldn't be solved through traditional means. He could kill people. He could burn buildings. He could terrorize businesses. But he couldn't terrorize an entire neighborhood. And he was beginning to understand that if he tried to break Harlem through violence, he would end up creating something far more dangerous than Bumpy Johnson. He would create a martyr. And martyrs, as Luciano had learned from history, were far more powerful than living men. On October 19th, Luciano called Bumpy back to the same office. This time, when Bumpy arrived, he found Luciano alone. There were no men standing guard. There were no threats implicit in the environment. Luciano was sitting behind his desk, and he looked tired. He looked like a man who had finally encountered something that his power couldn't simply destroy. "You've made your point," Luciano said without preamble. "In the past week, you've proven that you have the loyalty of Harlem. You've proven that your community will stand with you even when it costs them. You've proven that threatening them doesn't work, that trying to buy them off doesn't work, that trying to destroy your organization directly doesn't work. So, I'm making you an offer." Bumpy said nothing. He simply waited. "I'm willing to reduce the tribute to 5%, Luciano continued. 5% of your revenue, paid directly to me. In return, I will pull back my enforcer. I will stop trying to interfere with your operations. I will give you official recognition as the operator of Harlem, acting under my umbrella but with significant autonomy. You'll maintain your independence. You'll maintain your community's support. And I'll get a piece of the profit without having to wage a war that I'm increasingly convinced I can't win." Bumpy understood what Luciano was doing. He was finding a way to save face while acknowledging defeat. He was creating a structure where he could claim victory, could claim that he'd arranged for Bumpy to pay him, while actually allowing Bumpy to maintain complete independence. It was a compromise, and compromises were often the only way to resolve situations where both sides had become equally matched. 1%, Bumpy said. Luciano's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? 1% of my revenue? Not 5, 1. That's the price of my recognition of your power in New York. That's the price of agreeing to be under your umbrella. But I won't pay more than that." Luciano was quiet for a very long time. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. When he turned back, he was smiling slightly. 1%? That's a negotiation. That's you understanding that I do have power, that I am the most powerful man in this city. And 1% from Harlem, paid to Lucky Luciano, is an acknowledgement of that power. Very well, 1%. You'll pay it monthly, and you'll handle it personally. I want to see your face when you deliver it. That way, every month, you'll remember who allowed you to maintain your independence. Bumpy left the office that evening with an agreement that had been hammered out in less than an hour. 1% of his revenue would go to Luciano. His operations would be recognized as legitimate, operating under the umbrella of Luciano's organization, but with complete autonomy in Harlem. The war that could have devastated the neighborhood was prevented, and Bumpy had done something that no one thought was possible. He had negotiated with Lucky Luciano and come away with his community intact and his dignity preserved. When Bumpy returned to Harlem, the word spread immediately. He had met with Luciano again. He had made an agreement, and the agreement was that Harlem, would remain independent, would remain under Bumpy Johnson's control. The relief that flowed through the neighborhood was palpable. The war that everyone had feared wouldn't happen. Yorkshire Pete was waiting for him when he returned to his apartment. "What happened? Did you have to agree to his terms?" 1%, Bumpy said. "He gets 1% of the number's revenue. Everything else stays the same." Yorkshire Pete smiled. 1%, that's nothing. "No," Bumpy said. 1% is a lot. 1% is me acknowledging that I understand where power really lies. 1% is a small price for Harlem to remain Harlem. 1% is me teaching Luciano that you can't take a neighborhood if the neighborhood doesn't want to be taken. But you can negotiate with him. You can find common ground. You can survive in the presence of that kind of power if you're willing to be smart about it. Over the next few weeks, Bumpy paid Luciano his 1%. He did it personally, as Luciano had requested. He went to the same office, walked past the same guards, and delivered an envelope containing the monthly payment. And each time, Luciano would accept it with a slight nod, acknowledging both the payment and the continued respect that Bumpy had for his power. The story of the negotiation between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano spread through New York's underworld with remarkable speed. It became known as the night when a colored boy from Harlem had looked at the most powerful man in the city and said, "No." It became known as the time when a community's loyalty had proven more powerful than an organization's money. It became a parable about what real power actually was. Other criminals started to understand something that they'd been slow to grasp before. You could have money and guns and political connections, but if you didn't have community, if you didn't have the loyalty of the people who lived in your territory, then all of those resources meant very little. You could move against a single man, but moving against a neighborhood, against a community that had decided to stand together, that was something else entirely. The 5 families took note of what had happened. They had been prepared to support Luciano in whatever actions he deemed necessary. But seeing how the situation had been resolved, seeing that Bumpy Johnson had negotiated rather than surrendered, seeing that Harlem had remained essentially independent, they began to reconsider their approach to some of their other operations. If Bumpy Johnson could maintain his autonomy while acknowledging the greater power structure, maybe that was the way things were supposed to work. Over the following months, Luciano found himself increasingly impressed with Bumpy Johnson. The man was smart, he was principled, he was willing to bend but not to break, and he was proving to be a valuable asset. The 1% that flowed from Harlem to Luciano's accounts was consistent and reliable, and Bumpy's operations in Harlem were growing stronger, not weaker. The community's loyalty was increasing, not decreasing. Luciano had found what every powerful man looks for: a subordinate who could handle autonomy, who could maintain and grow an operation without requiring constant oversight. By the end of 1938, Lucky Luciano had begun to see Bumpy Johnson not as a subordinate in the traditional sense, but as something closer to an equal. They still had their formal hierarchy, with Luciano at the top and Bumpy acknowledging his supremacy through the monthly payment, but in practice, they were partners. Bumpy ran Harlem, Luciano ran everything else, and both of them understood that neither could do what they did without the other. Bumpy Johnson never forgot the lesson of that week in October 1938. He learned that power wasn't just about money and guns. He learned that a man who had the loyalty of his community could negotiate with anyone, even the most powerful criminal in America. He learned that the way to survive in the presence of overwhelming power was not to hide or to submit completely, but to find your own power and to use it as leverage. He learned that community could be weaponized in ways that traditional weapons never could be. When other young men from Harlem would come to him in the years that followed, seeking advice on how to build their own operations, how to navigate the criminal underworld, how to survive in a world where power could be taken away at any moment, Bumpy would tell them the same thing. You have to understand that there are different kinds of power. There's the power that comes from money, there's the power that comes from guns, there's the power that comes from political connections. But none of that matters if you don't have the power that comes from community. If you have that, if you truly have it, then you can negotiate with anyone, you can survive anything. Because in the end, no one can break what a community has decided to protect. The story of October 1938, when Bumpy Johnson sat down with Lucky Luciano and walked out with his independence intact, became part of the legend of Harlem. It became a story that was passed down through generations, told in bars and street corners and apartments, a story about a young man who had looked at impossible odds and found a way to win without even fighting. Lucky Luciano, for his part, never regretted the agreement he made with Bumpy Johnson. It became one of the most profitable relationships he had. Harlem flourished under Bumpy's control, and that flourishing generated revenue that flowed steadily to Luciano's accounts. More importantly, it served as a model for how he could maintain control over his vast empire without having to enforce that control through constant violence. It showed him that you could have subordinates who operated with significant autonomy, and they would be more productive, more loyal, and more valuable than subordinates who were constantly monitored and threatened. The five families, watching what had happened, began to make similar arrangements with operators in their own territories. They found that community-based power was far more stable than power imposed from above. They found that the best way to maintain control was to find men like Bumpy Johnson, men who had the loyalty of their neighborhoods, and to allow them significant autonomy while maintaining ultimate authority. This arrangement, this balance between autonomy and authority, would define the structure of organized crime in New York for the next several decades. Bumpy Johnson lived for another 30 years after that meeting with Lucky Luciano. In those 30 years, he would consolidate his power in Harlem, expand his operations, build schools and hospitals and community centers, earn the undying loyalty of an entire neighborhood. He would become, by any measure, a king. Not a king with a throne or a crown, but a king nonetheless. A man who was loved by his people, respected by his peers, feared by his enemies. When he died in 1968, the entire neighborhood mourned. Thousands of people came to his funeral, politicians and businessmen and ordinary citizens, all of them understanding that someone important had passed, someone who had stood between his community and the forces that wanted to exploit them, someone who had negotiated with the most powerful men in America and convinced them that respect was more valuable than domination. The lessons that Bumpy Johnson learned in October 1938, when he sat down with Lucky Luciano and found a way to preserve his community's independence, would echo far beyond Harlem. They would influence how power was understood and exercised throughout America. They would show that there was a form of power that transcended money and guns, a power that came from being valued by the people around you, from being loved and trusted and supported. And every person who heard the story, whether they were criminals or business people or ordinary people trying to navigate the world, understood something important. They understood that the most dangerous weapon in the world wasn't a gun. It wasn't money, it wasn't political power. It was the loyalty of a community. And if you had that, truly had it, then you could survive anything. You could negotiate with anyone. You could build something that would last long after you were gone. The war between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano never happened because Bumpy understood something that Luciano was slow to learn. In a battle between power and community, community always wins. Not because community is more powerful in a traditional sense, but because community is more valuable. And in the end, power without value is just noise. Community with value is everything.